Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more speaker who knows a whole lot about international collaboration and who also fights cybercrime on a global level. Mr. John Crain, Chief Security, Stability and Resiliency Officer at ICANN. John, thank you so much for joining Cyber Polygon. It's great to have you. I'd like to start with a question that I already asked Craig Jones, Cybercrime Director, Interpol, earlier today. Who do you think collaborates better and more effectively, cyber criminals or us, the good guys? Do you think that maybe coronavirus crisis affected this situation in any way?
So I think if you'd asked me this 3 months ago, pre-COVID, I would say it was absolutely the cyber criminals. But what COVID has done is it's put us all into a very combined mindset between all the players in the cybersecurity realm. So there was a large increased operation specifically around COVID. So I still think the bad guys are probably still a little bit better at coordination, but we are getting better.
Good. John, in the wake of the pandemic, cybercriminals created thousands of websites using the domain names COVID, coronavirus, pandemic, and the like. How can we stop? How can we prevent this activity? And what is the role of ICANN in this fight?
So specifically for COVID, we looked at this issue. I run a small security team at ICANN, and we re-engineered our team to specifically focus on this one topic for a while. And indeed, there were tens, if not hundreds of thousands of names registered with terms like COVID. We actually looked at hundreds of different terms in different languages and different scripts, including Cyrillic. But it turns out that when you actually go and look deeper at those names, that in fact, many of them are not actually being used for criminality. There are many other reasons that people register names. Many of them were used for something we call parking, where people buy names and they use them to generate advertising revenue. Now, you can have your opinion on whether or not that's a legitimate business, etc. Obviously, they believe it is, but it's certainly not malicious in any sense. So when we took the strings that we looked at, and then instead of looking at what names are risky or pose a risk, so many companies would look at these names and say, if it has the string COVID, it therefore represents a risk. We would look at that and say, well, is there any evidence that somebody's actually used it to do some form of criminality or negative harm to somebody? And generally speaking, those numbers are much lower. We would go from looking at roughly 4,000 to 5,000 names being registered down to about 500 or 600 names that appeared to have been used in some kind of malicious behavior. And by the time we actually got to the ones that were still active, and comes back to the previous question of how well are we working together, it turned out that 90% of those or more were already taken off of the internet. So we were actually finding very few names left over in the generic TLD space where we look at. So yes, it's a problem. I think it's hard to determine what people will register in advance. And if you're dealing with risk, like many of these companies are, it's okay to make what we call false positives because you're acting locally at a network and not globally. But because we act globally, we have to be much more stringent about our levels of what is actually bad versus what could be bad before we at ICANN can take action, or even sometimes the registries and registrars. And I think the long-term solution here is what you alluded to before, is to actually work together with the cybersecurity experts so we can better understand and put better data to what's going on, and then maybe change the policies in the future if the data supports it.
John, I know that during the pandemic, your organization joined the COVID-19 Cyber Threat Coalition. Could you please tell us about your contribution to the fight against cybercrime?
Okay, so there are many of these coalitions, and around COVID, there were a few new ones formed. My staff and I participate in many of these groups that work together to combat cyber criminality. Our main role is to be that of a subject matter expert. We at ICANN understand the domain name system and the DNS industry probably better than anybody else out there. So one of the things we can do is we can work with those who are combating criminality to understand what the effects of their actions will be and to make sure that they get the results they want. It's not always the case when you look at a domain name that you say, that's a bad domain name, make it go away. In many cases, and if we look at things like botnets and criminal infrastructure, what we want to do is we actually want to measure that too. So in those cases, it's not specifically stop the domain name resolving. It may also be make it resolve somewhere else so we can measure it. So our role is really that of subject matter experts, where we can come and work in a trusted environment, which is what these forums are. They're where people trust each other to work together, and then give the subject matter expertise that they need and maybe advise them to do things slightly differently. And of course, we also learn when we go there from these cybersecurity experts.
John, I'd like to go back to collaboration. Do you think that maybe this year's crisis changed our mindset about sharing information? Maybe we do business more openly now?
I would like to think so. Myself, I'm a bit of a cynic, so I hope things don't go back to the way they are. It's certainly been the case that during COVID, that there has been enhanced cooperation. We've seen swifter action by people in the industry, and I hope that that continues. Sharing of information and collaboration is the key to solving the cybersecurity issue in the long term, at least in my opinion.
John, we have a lot of people watching us right now. Do you have any recommendations on how people can protect their businesses and livelihoods online?
So many of the recommendations that I often give people are the same whether you're online or offline. Criminality happens in both environments. The internet is no different than the real world. Something my parents taught me was, if it looks too good to be true, it's not true. So a little bit of skepticism, a little bit of paranoia is okay, to sort of look at things and question it. Remember that you as an individual are probably not the target. A lot of the time the bad guys cast a wide net and they're not really bothered who they take that money from, as long as they get the money. Now, if you're running a business, you have to be a little bit more careful for some of the more targeted spear phishing and enterprise-based attacks. Those will often be attacking your executives around financial transactions. Be extra vigilant. If somebody sends you an email asking you to send money, pick up the phone, ask them. Basic things, question. That's all you need to do to be a little bit safer, is just question the things you get asked to do. If it seems even remotely unusual, question it.
Well, thank you for your advice, John. I have a question from one of our viewers that was submitted on the website. I'm going to read it. There are certain regions and domain zones where it's a lot more time-consuming to take down phishing websites because of abuse-resistant registers. What can be done to tackle this problem? Obviously, it relates to one of the questions that I asked earlier. Can you add anything?
So if it's a ICANN accredited registrar, they have certain responsibilities. They have to react. They have to investigate if reported to them. If they don't, then you can actually file a complaint with ICANN, and then we will talk to them. I will say that during COVID-19 specifically, we've seen a much faster and higher percentage of action by the registrars and the registries. When we measured our things and we were looking for active badness, most of it disappeared before we could look at it. When it comes to what we call country codes, which are the two-letter ending domain names, .uk for the United Kingdom, .us for the USA, .nl for the Netherlands, etc. When you see those will have local rules. The best thing you can do is make sure that you have good, solid evidence when you send it to them. That way, it's easy for them to look at it and actually take action. You have to remember that many of these registrars may be small businesses and they may not have the cyber expertise that you have. So try and act almost as a subject matter expertise for them when you send them information. In the ICANN realm, the registrars will come together and put out a paper about the kind of information they want. So they want to know obviously what the name is, but they also want to know what is the criminality or the maliciousness involved in the name, but they also ask for some evidence. You know, if there's a screenshot, you know, if it's a phish email, maybe send them a copy of the email. If it's pointing to a landing site and you have the expertise to look at that, if you are a non-cybersecurity person, please don't go looking at these websites. But if you do have that expertise, maybe take a screenshot to send to them. Give them the evidence so that you make their job easier. Now, if they're just not taking action because they don't want to, as I said, or some other reason, if it's an ICANN registrar, put in a complaint to ICANN. We do have rules around this and we will have discussions with them about it and hopefully get them to change their ways.
Well, thank you for always being ready to help. John, I wish we had more time to continue this conversation with you, but unfortunately we're almost out of time. Is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Only thank you for doing these conferences. I wish I could have been in Moscow again. This is a fantastic conference. The last 2 years have been brilliant. Collaboration is key, and events like this are part of that collaboration. So thank you very much. I'm glad I could join you even in these strange times.